Some kind of hush fell across everybody, so I'm going to go ahead and dive in while I can. Thank you for being here this morning. Before introducing our speaker, I do want to mention the reason we're here and for other events today is to celebrate the 90th birthday of Dr. Bill Wade. Bill, if you would stand for a moment. Thanks, Sam. We're joined as well by his wife Margaret and son, who are here. Come to greet them afterwards. I'm also delighted to welcome Ann Peak with us here today. Ann's husband Tom was my predecessor at King, and he passed away a couple of months ago. We're very happy to have Ann with us here today as well. Bill taught at King for 46 years, the longest tenured faculty in the history of the institution. He served in many capacities. Not only did he teach every class offered in history and political science at one point or another, not only did he serve as academic dean, not only did he begin the archive of the college, but he's also served as a faithful member of staff and a good friend to all of us. When I first got my job at King many years ago, unbidden, I received a letter from Bill welcoming me to the institution, making me feel welcome, even though he'd never laid eyes on me. He's regretted that letter ever since, for many, many years. So if you get a chance afterwards, please come and do celebrate this milestone. Come greet Bill and Margaret afterwards, and also Ann Peak. This is what has made King a great institution for many years, is to have faculty like Bill and like Tom Peak, people who have given their lives for the cause of education here, and it's an honor to have learned from and worked alongside them. Another honor we have today is to welcome David Painter. David graduated from King in 1970, doubtless his greatest accolade, I think. He was a member of a famous basketball team here at King, which he may or may not mention, I don't know, during his talk. After King, he won the Rhodes Scholarship. He's the only King student so far to do that. This took him over to Oxford, where he did a second degree, came back, and did a PhD at the University of North Carolina. After the PhD, or during the PhD, he worked for the Department of State. He's worked for the Department of Energy. I got those backwards. Energy and then State. And he now teaches at Georgetown University, where he's professor of international history. Among his many publications are many, many titles related to the Cold War, and he has also served as a Nobel Fellow in Oslo, spending a semester there not too long ago. Draped in honors, and yet none greater, perhaps, than speaking here in King today, I think. And really, mostly to be introduced by me. I think that's one of the pinnacles of anyone's career. So please join me in welcoming David Painter. Also, before you do that, if you have classes to go to afterwards, we understand that, but David will stick around, and if you want to chat or ask questions, we'll be here past 10. So, David Painter.
Well, it's not everybody gets introduced by Vladimir Putin. So that's good. And then I was noticing, have you all signed in to chapel? We had to do that when I was here 4 times a week and sign in. I hear you do it electronically now, so that's good. And this is unusual for, oh, there's a clock. I didn't see the clock at first. It's digital now. You never have a place without a clock. I know my father and my church growing up, he put a clock just where only the minister could see it to make sure we got out in time to go to the True Blue, make the first round of people at the True Blue Diner. But those are the old days. I'm going to talk today about the Cold War, and it's not quite a bait and switch. I was thinking, well, the Cold War is 45 years, and it's global, and how can you do this in 45 minutes? And so I decided to narrow the focus in a little bit more on the end of the Cold War. And what do I point this out? No? What do I point at? Right button. Not. See if you can, see if that's, see if, anyhow, I'm going to talk about the end of the Cold War, and if you know anything about me, I'm going to also work oil in. It's my specialty, history of the international oil industry and energy in general. And I think it's okay to do the end of the Cold War. There we go. How did that do that? What happened? Yes. Because understanding the end of the Cold War tells you a lot about what the Cold War was about. How it ends is important. It tells you a lot. It's important in its own right, but it tells you a lot about the nature and the dynamics of the Cold War. For those of us who grew up during the Cold War, it was a big surprise. If I were a betting person, I might have said we wouldn't make it. It was sort of close a few times, Cuban Missile Crisis. Nobody would have thought that the Cold War would have ended peacefully. And it really, that's one of the more remarkable achievements, I think, of the 20th century. And that's, I know that's a low bar, I mean, World War I, World War II and things, but that was a remarkable achievement. So studying how it ends is important. And most studies who look at the end of the Cold War, I've written about it, friends have written about it. They look at the arms race, they look at conflict in the Third World, they look at ideological and economic competition, and that's good because that's very important. The Cold War was about all these things. It was global, it was about US-Soviet competition, but it was also about East versus West. It was capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarian government, and it happened at the same time of decolonization, which is probably, in the long run, just as important as the Cold War, but they affected each other. In the Cold War, maybe 20 million people died between 1945 and 1990, 1945 and 1990. All but 200,000 of those people died in wars in the Third World. And so many studies sort of leave that out, and I think that's bad. But today I'm going to look at the role of energy in the end of the Cold War, because that's been a thing that several people have talked about. And I'm going to make 2 points, try to make 2 points. One, energy problems played a big role in the collapse of the Soviet system. People don't realize how important energy, especially oil and natural gas, were to the Soviet Union by its end. Exports, 80% of their hard currency earnings were from oil and gas exports. And you think about it, what did they make that anybody wanted? Vodka, not here, but caviar, they didn't really make that, and weapons. That's about all you would really want to buy, and you only bought the Soviet weapons if you couldn't get the American ones, because the American ones were generally better, maybe AK-47. But oil and gas they could sell. They had it sort of a standard commodity. Everybody needs energy. And so they were, by the end, by 1980, about 80% of their hard currency earnings were from oil and gas. And with that, they bought so they can keep producing oil and gas. I got caught in a little bit of a dead-end circle there. But prices collapsed in the 1980s. The oil price went, I'll have some charts up here, from over $30 a barrel to about, at one point, about 10. I'll have the numbers up in a second, but it's almost as big as the collapse between 2014 and 2015. And that decimated their earnings, had messed up their economy, and really played a role in the collapse. Now, that's interesting in its own right. If I were an economic historian of the Soviet Union, I'd be in good shape. Well, not quite, but it's also during the Cold War, and a lot of people claim that U.S. was behind this. This happened, and after it happened, everybody was surprised, and then people said, we planned this. We made this happen. We made this happen by cutting, making it hard for them to build a gas pipeline to sell their natural gas to the West, and we drove the prices down by talking to the Saudis. Saudi Arabia, you know, that's where the oil is, right? There's a lot of oil here, there's a lot of oil in the Soviet Union. Saudis have a lot of oil and they export. So what the Saudis do really affects the oil markets. And so people started saying, we planned this, we were good, we did it. And it's sort of like, this happened, we did this, Therefore, we caused this to happen. It's a little problem. I want to do a little bit of just how to do historical analysis. This sort of a case study of how you do it. And one of the most important lessons I'll get to again is correlation is not necessarily causation. Just because something happened after something else doesn't mean the first thing caused the second one. Now, it can cause the second one. I always tell my students, you can't have something happen afterwards cause something that happened before. That one doesn't work. Chronology is sort of important. So those are the two things. One, that this was important. Two, why did it happen? And historians, there's a famous essay, The Historian is a Detective. We don't really try to do whodunit. We try to say what happened and why. So what happened and why? How do you go about answering this question? How do you, people say things, how do you go about seeing if it's actually what happened? And that's what makes history fun. I do trips and give talks, it makes it fun, and it is sort of nice to try to figure out why things happen. And it's not just about why things happen in the past. If you can figure out why things happen in the past, you can probably do a good job figuring out why they happen today. It's the same techniques, it's the same skills. You have to analyze things, you have to look broadly for evidence, and you have to try to be objective. Try is the key word there. But there's a book called Victory by a journalist named Peter Schweitzer, and he claims, he's the main source for this claim that U.S. policies this is called the Reagan Victory School. Ronald Reagan won the Cold War by taking all these aggressive policies against the Soviet Union, and they realized they had no chance but to surrender, and we won, and that's why. And he has this, and he's the main person who says, about the oil price collapsing, he said the U.S. did that, and about the pipelines. And there's some other things, but he's the main source. And I talked to him, said, this is great. Footnotes. Where did you get this information? And it turns out most of it's interviews. Every now and then he'll cite a document. But they're not available to everyone else. And so I said, this is great. You're at the Hoover Institution. Why don't you put them in the archive for the rest of us to look at? And that's when he stopped emailing me. So, he's the source. So he does interviews, privileged access to documents. Unfortunately, some of the people interviewed, most of the people interviewed are now dead, so I can't interview them. Do you know anybody who can interview them? No, nobody can interview them now that they're dead. So interviews are out. So you have to go around and look for sources. What I did, went to the Reagan Library. Reagan Library is in Simi Valley, California. You go out in the middle of nowhere and turn left. And that gets you to Simi Valley. And then you leave Simi Valley and get in the middle of nowhere and turn right and go up the hill. And it's a beautiful setting. And they will let you see some documents. It's nice. Margaret Thatcher, I don't know if you guys remember Margaret Thatcher. I should have had the great poster of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan doing the Gone with the Wind poster. But Margaret Thatcher, she has a nice archive, and it's all online. I don't have to go to England. It's too bad, but somebody would pay for it. But it's all online. So a lot of documents there. Proofs, foreign relations of the United States. The State Department publishes declassified documents. Supposed to do it about a 30-year lag. They've published 2 volumes on the 1980s in the Soviet Union. Sometimes there's a big lag, but by law, they're supposed to give as good a record as they can, consistent with national security. In other words, they don't give away sources and methods of intelligence and things like that. So those are good. One of my main things is declassified CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. They have the operations division, the spies. And then they have the analyst. And the analytical division is great. These are scholars. They have access to all sorts of sources, languages, and they do great work. And thankfully, they've put all this online. CIA Electronic Reading Room. And for a while there, it was a little glitchy. You would search one term one day, and these documents would come up, and the next day you use the same term in other documents. And so old habits die hard. But they've got that straightened out. But you can get lots and lots of analytical reports. And every now and then some memoranda, policy papers come in. But basically it's analytical reports. I know a colleague at Georgetown who does Soviet history says, well, what are these? How would you classify these documents? I said, these are specialized, peer-reviewed secondary sources. You have scholars that peer-reviewed, people recover your work a lot, and they have access to a lot of information. And on the energy, if you read specialized journals in Russia, you can learn a lot about things. Now, it would be nice if you knew Russian. Now, if I were as good as Tom Peake was, I would have taught myself Russian. But I'm not. So I did a workaround. And the workaround is I use documents by people who read Russian and by people, I also don't read, I'd also have to know how to read Arabic. Farsi would be good. I can do Spanish, but that's not as important in this. So my workaround is I use CIA, mostly CIA reports. I use other people's secondary sources. I use some basic economic analysis. I mean, you do have to do that if you don't have documents telling you what happened. And even if you have the documents, you have to be able to interpret them. So this is how historians work. You look for the best possible sources. You read them. You read secondary sources. You try to put your documents in context. And you try to figure out what happened. And you should be modest about what you find. And I'm going to say at the end, I'm not going to say this happened. I'm going to say on the basis of what we know now, this is what I think happened. That doesn't get you on television too often. Though I was in Rocky, I think it was Rocky II. I was just walking by the Philadelphia Museum and they were filming it. A guy ran, and a bunch of kids ran by. A millisecond. Okay, it's not, I didn't get that. But, I don't have Russian, I don't have Arabic, and there's not a lot of documents on U.S.-Saudi relations. When I was at the Reagan Library, I put in my information request. They said, we have 800 pages of documents. I came out, and they didn't have 800 pages of documents. They had a lot of pages, which was a sheet says, withdrawn. You can't see this. And generally with the Saudis, that's withdrawn, you can't see it. Since this Cold War is over and the Soviet Union is no more, they're a little freer on those documents. Though some of the documents they gave me were in Polish because Reagan's first national security advisor was Polish. And I mentioned to them that wasn't very helpful since I didn't read Polish. But basically, as a historian, you figure out, okay, what is it you're trying to understand, how you get the best sources and hopefully primary sources because people's memories change. They don't always remember things correctly. I'm sure my memories that I've been sharing about my time here at King, we'd have to double check those with some other people. But the good stories tend to linger. But you do that and then you go through it and you try to figure things out. So that's what I tried to do. I tried to figure things out based on these sources. Now, the first one, I'm going to talk about the Siberian Gas Pipeline. There, look at this, the distances involved. That scale up there was 500 miles. So one of the problems that the Soviets had in this period, their oil and natural gas is in western Siberia. And get to western Siberia is like it's even harder than Sima Valley. You go out in the middle of nowhere and go north. I mean, this is far, far away from population centers, places where it's consumed. So they have to build these incredibly long pipelines through the Soviet Union, through Eastern Europe, to finally get the gas to Western Europe, because they don't want the money from Eastern Europe. You can't buy anything with it. You could buy a Trabant, that's an East German car made of plastic, that when they caught on fire, they burned to the ground. You want marks, francs, and actually what you get is dollars, which you can turn into marks and francs and yen and things which you can buy things useful with. But these pipelines are really, really long, and to move natural gas long distances, you need big pipe, large diameter pipe, and you need compressors to move the gas through the pipeline. The Soviets had a problem. Their industry, except for their military industry, was behind technology in the West, and they couldn't build large diameter pipelines. The bigger it is, the higher quality your steel has to be. So they would buy it from the Germans, the Italians. The British tried to sell, but the British one wasn't very good either, so that one didn't work. And the same thing with the compressors. Now, you could buy them from the United States, but we didn't like to sell stuff to the Soviets. So, and Western Europe's closer, and they're going to buy the gas, so you'd say, you send us the pipe, and we'll pay for it with the natural gas. Looks good. And this is when Western Europe is switching over to natural gas. They switched over to oil for their cars, but they're going to use natural gas for electricity and industry. So they need the natural gas. There's a demand for it. They have to get it with transportation. Well, you know, it replaces, not only they can sell it in Western Europe, they can replace coal, which is not doing very well in the Soviet Union, and oil in domestic markets. That gives them more oil to export, so they can make more hard currency. So this is a big deal for their economy, which is already in trouble in the 1970s. The CIA has some reports on the Soviet economy in the 1970s, and, well, the Soviet Union in general, population, life expectancy is declining, economic growth has ended, the Russian portion of the population is under 50%. Their leaders are aging and dying, and they're big problems. They think this will help them get out of it. They'll make all this money, and they can buy the grain, which they can't grow. They'll buy the machinery, which they can't build, and this will keep them rolling along. The Reagan administration said this is a weak spot. Actually, Carter tried it. The Carter administration, most everything the Reagan administration, the Carter administration tried, and it didn't work with them. But these guys said, think we're going to do it. And we're going to target the pipeline because we can cut off, we can tell our allies to cut off pipeline. And with the compressors, they have licenses from U.S. companies. So we can cut that off. And if they can't move it, they can't sell it. And they said, okay, well, how do we do this? And in December 81, they had to crack down in Poland, and they said, we'll punish them for that. Now, the problem was they had plans, NATO had plans, if the Soviets invaded Poland. Well, the Soviets didn't invade Poland, they got the Polish army to do it. So that's a little, but they went on to do it. Said, okay, we're not going to sell them anything. Then they said, not only we're not going to sell them anything, we're going to tell the Europeans, you can't sell them anything. Extraterritoriality. And the Europeans said, hey, we've got contracts. And they said, break the contracts. Now, Margaret Thatcher wasn't for breaking contracts. Margaret Thatcher was big friends with Ronald Reagan, which says, no, we can't break contracts. And the contract says if you don't deliver, you have to pay a penalty. Russians were pretty good capitalists, actually, when they wrote contracts, or good negotiators. So the West Europeans say, no, we need this energy. And gas from Russia is more reliable than gas from the Middle East. They cut us off all the time. And we need markets. The steel industry needs those markets. The companies that build equipment, they need to sell those markets. Europeans said, you know, you're telling us what to do. You're wanting us to punish the Soviets for telling the Poles what to do, and now you're telling us what to do. And then they said, we're not going to do it. And there's a great document from Margaret Thatcher, and she's meeting Caspar Weinberger, that doesn't ring any bells. He was Secretary of Defense, and she meets with him, and she tells Caspar Weinberger, I need a face-saving way to get out of this. And hearing it from Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan says, okay, we'll work this out. They basically drop the sanctions, and they say, we'll study the problem. Now, I worked in the government, some of you have worked in the government, and if we say, we're going to study the problem, it means we're not going to do anything about it. Because the study is going to take a long time. So they sort of drop that. They build a pipeline, they export the gas. It costs a little more, it's a little late, but they build it, lots of gas is going through. So, okay, what's the problem? Well, problem is natural gas is priced in relation to the price of oil. They index it to oil prices, especially for these long-term contracts. And, let's move over. In 1985, oil prices, let's see if I got my, yes, oil prices collapse. There's the thing, money of the day means like nominal, that's real. This is from BP Statistical Review of World Energy. They publish all these data. This is, I should have done more recent, the 2016 prices, but you look at the price of oil in 1980 in real terms, 105, 85 down to 60, 86 down to 31 in real terms. So that's a big drop. And of course, if you're getting 80% of your export earnings from oil and gas and the price of what you're selling drops by 2/3, you're going to get a lot less revenue. And so the oil price collapse is what really, really hurt them. And the irony for the Soviets, it happened just as Mikhail Gorbachev becomes head of the Soviet Union. Finally, the Soviet Union had a leader interested in reform, changing the economy, maybe opening up the political system, good relations with the West, and he needs revenues to do this, and he gets in, it all collapses. There's a great story. I have to work one joke in. This is Ronald Reagan had a lot of good jokes, by the way. Reagan got in 81. When he became president, Leonid Brezhnev was head of the Soviet Union. He dies. Then they put in Andropov, Yuri Andropov, and then he dies. Then they put in Chernenko, and he dies. And then they asked Reagan, why didn't you negotiate with the Soviets? He said, well, they kept dying off before I could negotiate with them. So they finally get, and Gorbachev all the other guys were in their 80s, so this guy's much younger. But he comes in, he wants to, perestroika is to restructure the economy, glasnost is to open up the society and hopefully the political system, and new thinking means let's end the Cold War, because we can't do these things internally if we're fighting and paying for a Cold War against the United States. For him, though, for Gorbachev was counting on, you can read, there's a few documents out, and his main advisor on foreign policy, Chernyayev, had published a diary, did a diary, and it's been translated to English. You can get it on the website. And basically, his plan was use these export earnings to import new machinery, restructure the economic system, get consumer goods and grain so the people would be happy, and make everything better. And just as he's done to do that, boop, he loses his money. He doesn't have the money, and that puts a lot of hard choices. If he doesn't import stuff, he can't import grain to feed the people, he can't import consumer goods to keep them happy, he can't import machinery to fix the economy. So if he doesn't, but if he does want to import it, how does he pay for it? And what they end up doing, the little that they earn, they buy more oil and gas equipment so they can export more oil and gas. They get caught in the circle, and of course the more they export, the price stays weak. So it causes lots of problems, and the CIA reports are wonderful on this. They talk about, here's his dilemma. And he has really no way out of this. And so it causes lots of problems. I'll show you a couple of statistics here. That's the prices dropping. This is from a CIA report. That's a screenshot. There we go. This is a screenshot from a report. You can see their hard currency export earnings between 70s and 80s, and you see right about 85 they began to drop off here. From 19, I think this is a billion, I think this is rubles. It doesn't matter if we do the volume. You can see how much they drop off down to 10, from 19 to 10 billion. And this really hurts them. And another way, there's a chart. It runs up the budget deficit. There's the deficit, low in 85, goes up, the export earnings going down, and you can see as the export earnings go down, the budget deficit goes up. They basically, it ruins pretty much ruins the economy. And then at the end, Gorbachev tries to reform the economy, take away communist control, and the economy, unfortunately for him, he didn't understand. It's all organized horizontally, and the thing that connects the firms is the Communist Party. You take out the links between things, it doesn't work. Because like they had one group of guys did exploration. Another guy's drilled the wells. The other guys produce the oil. The next guys transport it. The next guys refine it. The next guys sell it. But they don't have connections between each other. And so when they take away the Communist Party control, sounds like a good idea, right? Get rid of command economy. They don't have market mechanisms to replace this. So it's not just the price collapse, but what happens in the energy sector really kills them. So point one is, yeah, this was important. Gas exports went up, but what they earned from them went down. So energy problems really were a big factor in the collapse of the Soviet system. However, why did they have energy problems? And people said, well, we did it. The U.S., why did the prices collapse? Well, you notice this doesn't have anything about the Reagan administration and U.S. policy. This is why prices, in economic terms, prices quadrupled in the 70s. When prices went up, it gives people incentive to produce more and an incentive to consume less. This takes time. It doesn't happen, you know, like if gas prices went to $10 a barrel tomorrow, then it would go up high at the pump. And if you were unfortunate and owned a Hummer, you would be in trouble. You know, you're going to have to sell it and get something efficient if you think that's going to last. And then, but the trouble is nobody wants to buy that Hummer because they can't feed it. It's going to cost too much to put gas in it. So it takes time for the price increases to work their way through. But over time, high prices lead to increased production, lower consumption. Nice supply and demand curves, Econ 101 here. Also means they develop alternative sources of energy. If oil is too expensive, well, we use more natural gas. When the 70s started, everybody thought the coal industry was dead. When the 70s ended, the coal industry is booming because it's cheaper than oil. It used to be it's cheaper to burn oil, to use generate electricity and all sorts of things. They tried to develop nuclear power. That one didn't work out particularly well. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and that one didn't work out. And then solar, which also takes a long time, and didn't. But you also develop alternative sources of oil. Instead of getting it from the Middle East, Alaska finally comes online. They found oil in Alaska in '67. They didn't export it until '76 because you have to develop it. You have to build a pipeline. It takes a while. North Sea, you're drilling in deep water, and if you've ever been in the North Sea, it's always stormy. It's never nice in the North Sea. So that's tricky, and it's technologically difficult, and you have to have a high price or you're going to lose money. Same thing with Alaska. Mexico, which nationalized its industry in 1938, they said this might be a good time to stop selling in world markets again, and they happened to find a big field, the Cantarell field, in the Gulf of Mexico. Cantarell is funny that a fisherman noticed oil in his nets. So he reports it to the state-owned oil company, Pemex, you might want to drill here. And so they did, and he found this giant field, and his reward was they named the field after him. That's nice. That's a great honor. So Mexico, and then the Gulf of Mexico, but a lot of this is offshore. Offshore is difficult and expensive, so you have to have high prices. But over time, the amount of oil being produced goes up, especially outside of OPEC, but demand is still going down because prices are high, and it takes a while. And then in the 70s, one of the big things that happened in the 1970s is a lot of the countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Kuwait, they nationalized the oil industry. They bought it from the companies and thought, we're great, this is going to be good. What it does is it disintegrates the oil industry. It turns it into, instead of a vertically integrated industry, where the companies have an interest in keeping prices up because they're producers and refiners and consumers. It separates out, now these countries are just producers, the companies are buying it, they want to buy it as cheaply as possible. It introduces market principles into the international oil market, which had not been there. So the countries, they thought, well, great, we nationalized, we're in control, what happened to the price? We're sort of in deep trouble. And 50% of the oil sold in open markets by the 1980s 50% of oil in world markets was on open markets, so people are bidding for the price rather than this all being negotiated long-term contracts. And this puts a great deal of pressure on prices. And then the Saudis, they're what's known as a swing producer. When demand is up, they produce more. When demand is down, they produce less, and that balances the market and stabilizes prices. So the Saudis began in '81 to cut production to keep prices steady. They wanted to keep the prices up, and they cut production each year, and the prices kept going down. And all their competitors said, yeah, we'll do that, and they didn't do that. They cheated, and so by 1985, Saudi production, let's see if I have those figures. Yes, here's what happens to Saudi production between 1980 and 1986. Actually, and by August 85, it's 2.2 million barrels a day. That they can't earn much money, and they can't even run their petrochemical industry because they run that off when you produce, a lot of cases when you produce oil, you also get natural gas, and use the natural gas for your refineries. They're not even getting enough to do that. So their production is going down, they're producing less, they're getting less for it. Look what happens to their revenues. So the Saudis saying, we're being nice and trying to help keep OPEC alive, and nobody is helping us, and we're losing our shirts. So the Saudis decide to increase production, which drives prices down, but they're the low-cost producer. They can afford to do lower prices. And their plan is they will eventually, first by increasing production, lower prices, they'll regain markets, and eventually, it took them about 8 years, the revenues will eventually go up. We won't get as much per barrel, but we'll sell a lot more barrels. So the Saudis, this is an economic analysis, and again, the CIA reports, but open reports. Everybody can do this. It's pretty elementary. Price goes up, consumption goes down, price goes down, consumption goes up. And if you're a producer, markets can be cruel. So did the U.S. have any role in this? And these guys claim, yeah, the U.S., we had a big role. Every time that Reagan, William Casey, anybody remember William Casey? He was head of the CIA. He mumbled a lot. He'd go in a meeting and just mumble, and he'd come out of the meeting and he said Reagan agreed to this, and nobody was really sure, and so his chief of staff had to check on everything. Casey dies, was it 86 or 87? He dies just in time they can't interview him for the Iran-Contra affair. I don't think he did that on purpose. But, he's removed as a source. Now, Weinberger was Secretary of Defense, and he would obviously meet with the Saudis a lot. Nobody says Schultz, George Schultz, who was Secretary of State. Weinberger I have a little animus against because he almost ran over me one day. I was walking near the Watergate complex, and somebody roars out of an underground garage in a Cadillac and almost runs over me, and I look at it, and it's Cap Weinberger. So just reveal my bias here. Y'all still forgot. But no, Cap Weinberger. And so he says, when they met the Saudis, they always said, why don't you lower prices? We're lobbying for lower prices. The problem is, all those documents, or almost all of them, are classified. I don't know what he said to King Fahd or Prince whatever, Prince Bandar. They're not releasing that. Saudis are certainly not releasing that. The few documents you get some documents that say, here's what we're going to talk about in today's meeting. They'll have a list of talking points. That's a big thing in the government, doing talking points for the big guy so he doesn't stray, keeps him on his talking points, and they're not on there. In 2007, I was at a conference in Moscow on oil. Unfortunately, it was in November, so it was not pleasant weather. It was very, very cold. And one of the guys on the panel was the head of Middle East Division of the CIA in this time period. And he said, ask him about this. And he said, well, I was with Casey on every trip he made to the Middle East, and he never mentioned this. Okay. So he's saying we never mentioned it. Schweitzer says he talked to people, and they said they mentioned it. We don't have documents. That's the problem. And as I say, the Saudis don't do it. I talked to a couple of other people who were in the U.S., who were specialists. One guy was in the U.S. Embassy in Saudi Arabia. Another guy was doing that from the U.S. side. And they said, we never talked about lower prices. We were worried about other things, but we never put pressure. They wouldn't have listened to us if we had. So my interviews contradict Schweitzer's interviews, but I didn't talk to Reagan, Casey, or Weinberg. And nobody's talking to them now. The other thing is, the Saudis, they didn't do anything until fall 1985. We started, supposedly, lobbying them January 1981. And it takes them, maybe the decision-making process is slow in Saudi Arabia, right? But yeah, that's pretty slow. So I don't think that's what happened. They waited till when the prices and the volume, the revenues were intolerable, they got down there. And the other thing is, and this is always important, we talk about the oil industry. Well, the oil industry in the United States is very divided. You've got big companies, you've got little companies, you've got medium companies. If this were the 80s, I talk about Ewing Oil, J.R. Ewing in Dallas. That's a small company. Exxon is a big company, very big. But if you're a East Texas oil producer, you like high prices, right? You need high prices. And they were going through a boom with high prices, and then the prices collapsed. And I'll tell you a Texas joke. After the prices collapsed and these producers got wiped out, the joke was, what's the difference between a pigeon and an East Texas oil man? A pigeon can still make a deposit on a Mercedes. So, the pressure they're getting from the oil industry is different. Some consumers want lower prices. The problem with the U.S., it's also the U.S. strength. U.S. is a major producer and a major consumer at the same time. Now, that can be difficult to do policy, but that can be great because when prices are up, we're doing great, our producers are doing great, and prices down, our consumers are doing great. So U.S. is a pretty good position on most of this, but this is why I don't think there was a big U.S. role. Now, a couple of other things. So we sold the Saudis a lot of arms. Well, we've always sold the Saudis a lot of arms. They're one of the major arms purchasers. We just don't use them very well or at all. And then we promised that we would prevent the monarchy from being overthrown. You're supposed to say, we will protect your territorial integrity and being invaded. But we said we'll protect the monarchy. And that was a sensitive topic in the early 80s because of something that happened. Anybody remember what happened maybe January 16th, 1979? The Shah of Iran left Iran. So the Saudis are thinking, hey, getting rid of monarchy is not a really good thing. We may, maybe you guys would like to help us. So I love this title. History, what is it? Mark Twain said, you make history rhyme. I couldn't make it rhyme, but I can at least make it alliterative. Reagan used to call the Soviet Union the evil empire. So energy and the end of the evil empire. And so it's like there's two parts. Yes, energy was a big deal. Most studies, people neglect it. They just sort of say, well, that's oil and gas, we don't deal with this. And or they'll cite Schweitzer or some other stuff that's not very. But U.S. efforts to block the pipeline failed. They built the pipeline and their exports of natural gas went up throughout the 80s. So that one didn't work, but the price went down. And that's the key, is what happened to prices. But there's no evidence that U.S. Actions played a role. Based on available evidence, you can't say this happened. Based on it, what is it? You can't prove a negative. I can't say it didn't happen. I can't, I think it's possible that Reagan and some of the guys mentioned to the Saudis, hey, we'd like to have lower prices. But I don't think that's why the Saudis did what they did. I think there are good reasons using economic analysis and looking at Saudi behavior over a long period of time. They did it because it's cost them a lot of money. And so and they went down with long-term changes in the world oil economy. most of which began before Reagan took office. So these people who said Reagan did this, they're taking credit for things that resulted from other causes. It didn't happen in the U.S. And there's a correlation is not causation. And I think I don't know if it's a Grimm's fairy tale. It's one of the fairy tales about the rooster who crows every morning, and then the sun comes up. And so the rooster is convinced that the sun comes up because he crows every morning. But just because the rooster crows, that's not why the sun came up. And correlation is not causation. And that's how you try to get at what happened and why as a historian. I didn't bring my Stalin picture, so sorry. I told Vladimir here I had a picture of my son did a Photoshop of the famous Alta picture of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And I'm looking at it one day, and Stalin's face looked really familiar. And he put my face in Stalin. I said, why Stalin? And I don't beat my son. I don't send him to vacations in Siberia. And it turned out it was one of his friends at school was scared of me because he thought I looked like Stalin. And I don't know. I'm not really sure where that came from. But it's 10 o'clock. I'd like to, I'll talk about this as long as you want to. But I'd like for you to ask questions at anything I left out. You get in it's a limited amount of time. It's always possible I left out some chains in the causation, and I filled them in my mind because, and I didn't fill them in up here. So thank you, and I'm ready to answer questions, or you're ready to go to class, or...
I'm curious, animosity between historians and journalists and has Schweitzer made any effort whatsoever to refute your findings?
I'm not sure he will get to it eventually, because I gave a paper like this at a conference on Reagan, and what's the guy's name? Ken Edelman was there, who was also in the Reagan administration, so I'm sure it got back to him at some point. But, I'm a historian, and nobody is reading my work. I mean, a smaller number of people. Not nobody. My students read it. Yeah, that's how you get your stuff read. You assign it. But so far, he wasn't very open to making these documents available to everybody else. And he's there at the Hoover Institution. They have an archive. A lot of people donate papers, and then other people get to look at them and try to see if they agree or disagree. So everybody just repeats his story. There's a story, one of the stories they tell is that the U.S. gave the Soviets were stealing technology, so they gave them bad software, and they put it on one of their compressors, and it blew it up. And boy, wasn't that great. Some people would say that's an act of terrorism, but okay, they blew it up, and everybody repeats the story. The problem is, the guy who told the story he tells where the pipeline, he doesn't know where the pipeline is. He's got the pipeline running through Kazakhstan. Well, I know the Soviets were real good, but unless they got lost, you don't get from, northern Siberia to Western Europe by going through Kazakhstan. It's not on the way. We'd have to go down. And then another thing about that is, it's not clear if the Soviets were actually using computer controls, digital controls on their pipelines. This is the early 80s. Now, you guys don't remember, most of the students don't remember the early 80s, but I remember the early 80s. We were just getting personal computers. Computers weren't, one of the big weaknesses of the Soviet Union was lack of computers. And the Soviet engineers said, we didn't use digital controls, it was all manual. And so if you guys infected the software, I don't know where it went, but we didn't have any software. The software is the guy turning the knobs or something. And there was an explosion, but it turned out that there was a leak in the pipeline, so the pressure's dropping, so the operator keeps on turning up the volume to keep the pressure up, which means it's leaking even more, and then a train goes by and blows out a spark and causes an explosion. So, it's trying, this is, for historians, the 80s are relatively recent history in terms of getting primary documents. It's getting so far back where you can't interview people. when I started, maybe some of these people still alive, but it's that period between the documents, after the people who were involved die, that you could interview, but before the documents are out. So, as I say, that's my take on what I have. You can't prove what they say on the documents we have. And that's not going to sell many. Journalists will just tell you, this is what happened. And that sounds great. You get on TV, and so he hasn't, I'm sure that I'll get some pushback at some point.
You made a case for Soviet income going down. What about the need to spend? The Star Wars competition?
Well, the Soviets didn't spend, Gorbachev talked to some scientists, and they said, if you try to count, the military wanted to spend to count. And the scientist says, well, okay, one, they're many, many years away from doing this. And we still don't have a functioning. So they're many, 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 many years away. And second, even if they do it, we can counter it by building more missiles. And they also built a missile that was maneuverable in the launch stage where we would try to get it. So they could counter it cheaply. Star Wars mainly caused problems because the Soviets, it was more of a symbolic issue both for the U.S. and the Soviets, but it never really had that big of impact. Gorbachev tried to cut military spending, though his first year in, he wanted to get out of Afghanistan, but the military didn't want to lose, so he says, okay, you got a year, you can spend more, come back in a year and tell me everything's good. And came back in a year and it was worse, and he says, okay, you've had a shot, get out. So the military spending was eating up a lot of their budget, and he wants to end the Cold War so he can cut back military spending, and also the Cold War is the justification for controlling domestic society. We can't have Western journalists here, we can't have free discussion because that's spies. So he wants to end all that. Gorbachev is sort of a very tragic character. He's the guy who caused the Soviet Union collapse. And he did it for he did it for good reasons. He wanted to introduce, he was a little idealistic. He wanted to turn the Soviet Union into Sweden. He wanted to turn it into a nice social democracy. And that's a stretch anyhow. But it became a big stretch when he doesn't have the revenues. He wants to ease the transition to a market economy. He doesn't want a crash, shock, austerity program. And of course, that's what they get in the 1990s. And the economy and everything craters in the 90s, and then we get Putin back in, and Putin gets in. Remember you? Thank you. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Putin gets back in as oil prices start back up, so that helps him out a lot. They're probably heading. One of my colleagues at Georgetown has been working on Soviet oil and gas since the 80s, and he goes there a lot, and he says they're probably looking at big problems in the next 10 years because they're not invested enough to keep develop new fields, to keep the equipment up, repair and maintenance and stuff. They're just basically stealing the money. And it's even harder now with oil prices down because the Saudis in 2014 did exactly what they did in 1985. In 2014, oil prices were over $100 a barrel, and shale oil was big in the U.S. So the Saudis said, we're going to jack up production and force the price down, and we'll force all those shale producers out. What they didn't count on is the shale producers in the U.S. got more efficient. They got better at what they do, and they thought, well, if we get it under $70 a barrel, you can't produce shale oil. Then said, well, if we get it under 60, now we have to get it under 50. And some guys that are really good producers in the shale oil can do it at maybe 40 because they learned over time. They're much more efficient in how they produce. They're better at finding the good fields, only developing the good ones, and using better technology. And shale oil in the U.S. is now the new swing producer. They can go on and off. They can jack up or move down very easily because it's a much more flexible industry. It's not as capital intensive. So the U.S., we're back in the driver's seat as far as energy now. Some people get a little too enthusiastic and say we're energy independent. And they notice they say energy independent. They don't say oil independent. Yeah, we got a lot of natural gas. We got a lot of oil. We have a lot of coal. But you don't run cars on coal. That's a no. You can't run. You don't want to run cars on nuclear power. That's real bad. Can you imagine a Pinto with a nuclear reactor. That would be a bad thing. You can run cars and buses on natural gas, but that's a problem of the tank size. Just producing more is not going to do it. To become independent, you're going to have to, conservation, efficiency, public transportation. When I was growing up, and you remember the Fuller bus that used to run up and down the highway? You could take a bus from here to Meadowview. And Meadowview is sort of a wide spot in the road. You could take a bus, you could take a train, and all of that's gone. And that, things like that and housing patterns are path dependent. You've built in structures of consumption that are going to cause problems over a long time. And you have to change those. You can't just outproduce it because you produce too much. And, the big elephant in the room I haven't talked about is climate change. And, climate doesn't care how many miles per gallon your car gets. It just cares how many gallons you're burning. So there's some good incentives for doing more efficient and different uses of energy. But you can't do without energy.
Well, you obviously think about this a lot. Why not electric cars and move it out with new nuclear technology if we can do something with the spent fuel?
Yeah, well, there's the big if, isn't it? I was talking to a nuclear engineer, and he gave this talk. He was talking about the Chinese are building 1,000 nuclear plants a year, and he's saying this is a really bad idea. And basically, if nuclear power is inexpensive, it's not safe, and if you make it safe, it's not inexpensive. Now, as you say, if they could do something, if they could do with the new small modular reactors, and they could do something to store the spent fuel, maybe that will work. But the problem with nuclear power, from the engineer's point of view, is all you're doing is boiling water. And to boil water, you need 212 Fahrenheit, 100 centigrade, and a nuclear reactor is 2,000 degrees. It's overkill. And it's sort of technological overkill, but the electric car, unless you get your electricity in a low carbon way, it's not really changing anything. And if you don't do something about traffic and housing patterns, electric cars jam up the streets the same as gasoline powered cars. And in fact, in Washington, it's a big problem because they let people in a hybrid car use the high occupancy lanes with only one person. So we have more hybrid vehicles anywhere else in the country so that people can ride the high occupancy lanes. And they become crowded, sort of lose their purpose. Okay, yeah.
I know this one is frozen fast, those prognostication, but given the situation in Russia today and conflict and tension in this country and that part of the world that has existed since the Cold War, do you have any thoughts on what the future looks like?
Well, I think there's two people to credit with the statement. Prediction's really difficult, especially about the future. One of them was a nuclear physicist named Niels Bohr, and the other was the great philosopher Yogi Berra. But you get in trouble predicting the future. I don't see a lot of improvements. I mean, it's such the division, the ethnic divisions, for example. Crimea had not been part of the Ukraine to the 1950s when Nikita Khrushchev said, "I'll just give it to the Ukraine." And it's ethnically Russian, but then the people who were there before the Russians came, they said, hey, but it was ethnically somebody else, Tatars, before it was Russian. And that part of the world, unless they can do something about ethnic tensions, it can be really bad. I had a student from Ukraine, and her parents' father was from Eastern Ukraine and spoke Russian, his mother from Western Ukraine and spoke Ukrainian, and they weren't living together anymore. And so that kind of thing, I don't see a lot of way out. Confronting them doesn't seem to help. I know we have a lot of Russian graduate students at Georgetown, and they don't like the dictatorship and everything, but boy, they were, they said, these attacks on Russia make me feel nationalist. But that doesn't mean we want to support him. But I think Putin's rating is really high. What are your polls running? Make you feel good about it. I'm joking with Martin. He went to Halloween dressed as Vladimir Putin, and I can't look at him anymore without seeing Vladimir Putin. Yeah, I said, Stalin is afraid of Putin? No, Stalin's not afraid of Putin. Yeah, no, I don't see a lot of good, but I don't see that we have to get back to where things were either. But I'd hate to predict on that. Now, if I were being paid, maybe at State Department or CIA or something, you're paid to make a prediction, They don't, but I'm not getting paid to make predictions, and I'm nervous about making predictions, really. Though I made some good ones. I made one once after the first Gulf War. Somebody asked me about how this would help Norman Schwarzkopf become a big political figure, and I said, no, I think it's going to be Colin Powell. Got lucky. I saved that clipping. But that was lucky. No, that was not hard. I mean, Norman Schwarzkopf would not have been a great statesman. Colin Powell I think that was an easy one. But it is hard to predict. I mean, the best you can do, the present and the future is not going to be like the past, but you really have to look to the past to understand the present and to get any idea of what's going to happen in the future. Things don't just start new every day. All these things have roots and causes, and in history we look at continuity, but you also have to be aware you have to look at change. A lot of people, like with the end of the Cold War, people thought it's been going on a long time, it's going to keep on going on a long time, and it didn't factor. Well, it might change. Maybe our assumptions why it's lasting were wrong. And so I think the nice thing about doing the history, it's not moving. It's like trying to do in the present. Things are moving. You can go back and you can look at things and you can say, well, why didn't we see this? What are the biases? And then you can if we're looking at something today, what is it we're not looking at? What is it we're not understanding? What are we underestimating or misunderestimating, as a former president once said? What are we underestimating and what are we putting too much emphasis on? And you really have to be guided by that. It's the hardest thing in history is facts. It is, things did happen. We have different, we can't find out exactly what happened. Von Branca was not right. We can't get it as it actually was. But we can get better. I did have I shortened the thing. The Cold War was bad. It could have been worse. But we should try to do better. And I think the only way we're going to do better is to understand the past as a first step in trying to do better.
Well, does that past perspective give you any hint as to what's going to happen with the apparent rise in the drive to ethnic independence? I'm thinking of the Kurds.
Catalan, yeah. No, that's a lot of those things like in Catalonia. Fortunately, I think it's only 40% who really want to break away. I mean, Catalonia, they're misusing the past. I mean, they were treated badly under Franco, but pretty much everybody was treated badly under Franco in Spain. And you remember Franco, but I imagine most people don't. I was actually traveled in Spain when Franco was still alive, and it was a pretty scary place. And the Catalans were treated very badly, but that's a misuse of the past. You can go back and say, yeah, they were mistreated badly in the 30s and the 40s and 50s, but after the restoration of democracy in Spain, they've gotten autonomy. They're the richest region. You'd have to put that past in perspective. You can't be like what the Serbs were saying. It's still the battle in 1390. Well, yeah, get over it. A lot's happened since 1390. You have to understand that. And you have to understand where people are coming from, but you also have to, it's change as well as continuity. And, knowing those past it does, it's a necessary, but it's not sufficient condition of understanding what we're doing now and what we should be doing in terms of policy.
I should have had us applaud before the great attrition of people going off to classes. Please join me in thanking David. We'll linger for a bit, and then we'll head to lunch at the cafeteria. Anybody who wants to join us, we're going to be in the Tipton room probably by about 11:15, and then the party will be at 2:30 in the boardroom. That'll go for about 2 hours, so drop in whenever for that. But thanks again, David, and thank you for being here.
That was great.